lead, which include professional and leadership development programming, board matching, and working with local nonprofits to maximize their effectiveness in the community. This series is produced in partnership with Jones, a company whose mission is to develop leaders and human systems that counter oppression through diversity, inclusion, and organizational effectiveness. Jones's CEO is Stephen Jones, and he's a member of the Lead San Diego Board of Directors. We are so grateful for his and his team's support on this project. This is a webinar that's meant to help you understand what's happening in our ever-changing, rapidly changing world, and to connect you with sources of inspiration and empowerment, and really most importantly, equip you with the tools you need to lead your teams and lead your families. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed by ABC 10 News, a longtime partner of Lead San Diego. Thank you, 10 News. Please use the Q&A button of your screen to send us questions for our guests, and we're also going to take questions from our viewers on Facebook as well. My colleague and program manager Kim Wynn is at the controls, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible today. Today's topic is white privilege and being anti-racist. Now, these are two terms that are critical to understanding the work of dismantling systemic racism in our country. But what exactly do these terms mean? What do they mean in our day-to-day lives? We're going to break things down today with our experts so that we are able to recognize and act accordingly as leaders of teams and leaders of families, and really as humans in the world trying to do the right thing. I'm so grateful to our guests for joining us today. Jordan Harrison is a professional speaker, education consultant, and international youth development specialist. Mr. Harrison's work has engaged more than 250,000 people on anti-racism, equity, inclusion, and how to build people and institutions on equity. He is Senior Director of Programs for Reality Changers, where he has worked with more than 15,000 8th to 12th graders, and they are first-generation, low-income, college-bound students. His work in that space earned him a full fellowship to Harvard University, where he earned his master's in education in 2018. Mr. Harrison is also a recent graduate of Lead San Diego's Impact Program. Welcome, Jordan Harrison.
For having me, glad to be here.
Lori Nelson is the Director of Programs and a Principal Consultant at our partner Jones. For over 20 years, Ms. Nelson has been a leader in designing programs and training modules that successfully reduce bias and conflict in both schools and workplaces. She has designed more than 40 programs for schools and organizations and specializes in developing training sessions that use the arts to increase engagement and impact on the groups that she works with. Ms. Nelson teaches at the Los Angeles County High School for the Arts. Her popular service learning class teaches young artists communication skills, cultural competency, and how their talents to create safer and more inclusive schools. Welcome, Lori Nelson.
Thank you. Very happy to be here with you.
Gyasi Redding is a San Diego native. He was born and raised in southeastern San Diego. Now a resident of Ocean Beach, Mr. Redding is an instructor at Monarch School, which serves students impacted by homelessness. He is a physical education coach working with the basketball, football, and soccer programs at Monarch. Mr. Redding's commentary entitled, "Thanks for the social media posts, now let's see some real anti-racism activism," was recently published in the San Diego Union Tribune, and we'll drop a link to that piece in the chat. Welcome, Gyasi Redding.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you all for being with us today. First, let's all get clear on what we're talking about when we're talking about white privilege. What does this mean, both like on an institutional level and also in our day-to-day lives? And Jordan, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me again. It's a joy to be here. And I think I want to talk about two aspects of it. The first aspect being unearned advantage by being white in America that centers whiteness as normalcy or centers as white as right, and anything outside of white then is abnormal or not the standard. The second thing that white privilege also affords people is the ability to not necessarily worry or concern about some other things. A great article on this is by Peggy McIntosh, who talks about unpacking the invisible knapsack. And I encourage people to look at that, the invisible backpack, and it looks at all the different things that white folks might not have to consider that Black people might have to or have to in their day-to-day lives. And I think a great example to really describe white privilege, Dr. Jones mentioned on the last webinar with you all, and he talked about how America was built for right-handed people. And so if you're right-handed, you have an advantage in America. Scissors work for you, school desks work for you. I remember when I was younger, I sat at a left-hand desk, you have to write differently. Your whole life is destroyed. You're just like, why, who made this desk? And simultaneously, we have to look at how was America built, who was it built for, and who might not have been at that table when it was built, and how does that impact how we are having our day-to-day experience now?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jordan. Lori, love to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, I think the biggest privilege of all, if you will, is not having to even think of yourself as white. Instead, white people have the privilege or the luxury to just say, I'm an individual and treat me like I'm an individual, not being aware of being a part of a group, and feeling that you can also just opt out of this whole conversation. You know, white people who are staying engaged in anti-racist work are doing it by choice. But a great number of white people are really well aware that it's not something that they have to do. That's huge privilege.
Lori, can you explain on a day-to-day level, like what are we talking about? Like how could a white person become more attuned to this in the day-to-day?
Well, I think very much agreeing with what Jordan said. I think one great way to begin to learn is to just simply read. A wonderful place to start is Peggy McIntosh's article. It was written in 1988 called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And she lists, I think, 40 something specific privileges, things that people don't think about. I think white privilege is one of those things that once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. It's just something that is everywhere, but it is often invisible at first. So the first step is choosing to learn to see it. That's the big step. And then just finding out more about it. And then it just sort of just happens naturally as once you're aware of it. And then I think using your own imagination, like considering in any situation, how would this interaction I just had at the grocery store, when I just got pulled over by the police, whatever these are, imagining what would it be like if I wasn't white? Did my being white make a difference in this moment or did it not? Some of it is just really about choosing to be mindful of what is in every interaction that you have. Like a specific privilege, this has happened to me several times. I happened to drive a really fast car for a while. I didn't drive it fast. It was just a fast car that I owned and drove. And I frequently got pulled over because it was seen as a car that particularly young men drove. And I would get pulled over and not get a ticket. And just the privilege that comes with, my biggest worry in getting pulled over was how expensive is this ticket going to be? Mm-hmm. That is an incredibly different experience than many of my friends who have very, very good reason to feel afraid when just being asked to pull over for maybe what be a traffic violation.
Thank you, Lori. Coach, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think just in a practical sense of everyday life, I think white privilege is basically not having to grow up with this awareness that there's a different set of rules for you. Mm-hmm. It's not having to sit down with your father at, 6, 7, 8 and have him, basically explain, there are things that you have to do to survive in this world that people who don't look like you don't, and I had that conversation with my dad, and it's a tough thing as a kid to really have to spend your life being so aware of everything that you're doing at all times, because you really just never know when it may impact your life. Your life may be adversely impacted just by the color of your skin. And so when that's not a worry for people, like Lori said, it is so easy for it to be invisible because you walk around every day and you're fine. But for me, for Black people, for even other people of color, it's something that we don't have the luxury of not being aware of. I have to be aware of everything that I do, the things that I say, even just where I am. Because someone could decide that I'm in a place that they don't think I belong, and I could be negatively impacted by that.
You know, Gyasi, if I could add to that,
Yeah.
you just reminded me of something that happened years ago when I know we've all worked with high school students, and I was with a high school student talking about these issues. And we were talking about one of the issues that we brought up in the group is how often do you think about your race? And it's a very seemingly simple question, but of course, most of the white group never or rarely, or, you know, only if somebody pointed out to him. And one of the young men kind of smiled and he said, well, you know, people talked about seeing it often. He says, I only think about it twice a day. And I was a little puzzled and I said, really? You only think about it twice a day? He said, yeah, only when I'm awake or when I'm asleep. And we laughed at his cleverness, you know, and yet that was probably 20 years ago. And I remember his answer. It was a very powerful and truthful answer.
As we are all, most of us are operating remotely, how do we see white privilege coming up as we are distanced from each other?
I mean, I can speak to it. One of the things I could talk about is in working with students, I think from a generational sense, I think sometimes when we talk about white privilege, we're talking about the now, but it has to be set in the context of the history of America and the different facets that allow there to be such inequities across generational wealth, housing access, and different things. Like one of the things in education we talk about and work with students, primarily students of color, is being mindful of things like asking them to have on their screen and background because they might be living in an intergenerational family. They might be just working. Like I know a lot of my students had to take a job to help out their family. I think COVID actually gave us a season where we are seeing these racial inequities just exacerbated. We look at the amount of Black people that have essential jobs, but yet they're inessential to our lives if we can dispose of them due to COVID or different things. And if we're looking at the health, just the health care for Black folks, there's so many things that we're seeing in COVID that's just highlighting the inequities. And I think the frustration comes in for Black folks because white folks are entering into this conversation and Black folks are like, this has been something that we have been holding and enduring for so long. And so white privilege is the ability to enter this conversation now when we've been feeling this and saying this for generations.
Mm-hmm. Enter it and dominate it.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's part of the frustration. It's interesting question, Elizabeth, because I've been asked this and I've thought about how in interracial dialogues or something, it's different in the Zoom format. Do people feel safer being at home having these conversations not through a screen, or is it safer to be in person? And I think some really interesting things are happening. I do think I have seen some sense of greater safety because, you know, if I'm in the workplace and I'm having a difficult racial conversation with someone on my team, and then I don't have to walk past their desk in 20 minutes, right? I get to kind of cool off or whatever at home. And so are seeing some different dynamics. And sometimes I think part of the positive I'm seeing is that in some environments, people are being more truthful, you know, because I think just the format does give people space to be braver, I guess, in some ways. And so I think that part of it is a positive thing when people are braver to tell their truth.
I would agree with you that we have been seeing in our lead programming just more deeper connections and deeper level of vulnerability online. I think it almost like removes some of the fear and the barriers. You know, instead of standing up in front of a bunch of people, you know, you're connecting through the screen, and I think that people are just a little bit more willing to be messy and to share in a more meaningful way. To go back to Jordan's point. Do you think that the disproportionate deaths among the African American and Latinx communities have really highlighted and kind of opened up and maybe created more awareness of these inequities? I mean, do you think now people are like, whoa, oh, this is what you're talking about? Like,
yeah, and it's unfortunate. It's incredibly unfortunate that it has to be spurred upon by George Floyd's death, of seeing someone killed for over 8 minutes sitting there, and Breonna Taylor, and the fact that there is a long list of names from the histories that we can talk about, but it's frustrating that these moments, that it has to take death for a conversation to occur. It has to take the visual, motion pictured seeing of someone dying irrationally to stir the soul of someone to connect to their humanity. Because I think this conversation is also based in our view of humanity, how we see each other, and how we really can design and fight for a world while we're fighting for each other, and seeing ourselves as being interconnected.
Coach, it looked like you wanted to say something.
I was just agreeing with with everything that Jordan was saying. I think it's a thing where, like he said, it's just sometimes can be discouraging, that it takes such an event, such a tragedy to kind of get the attention of people who could be helping, or could be in the conversation, or could be, aiding with the cause. And again, to the point of just what we were talking about, the disparities, obviously I'm an educator, so I would say 90+% of the kids that I teach are Black or Latinx, and seeing the conditions that they're in, trying to learn from home, it's crazy. I've got friends, their kids are, they've got their own laptop, they got their own iPad, they're fine. Meanwhile, my kids are trying to stand outside of businesses to get Wi-Fi for an hour a day.
Right.
And so it's just really, this situation has just really, like you said, exacerbated these problems and really just shoved them to the forefront where they can't be ignored anymore.
Right, both the pandemic and George Floyd's murder, and
exactly.
both of those things happening at the same time. Let's go to getting clear now on what we're talking about when we're talking about being anti-racist and what anti-racist actions are. And I go back to Jordan, because we invited Jordan to come and speak to our Young Leaders program, and he gave such a great explanation there. And I'm hoping you'll do the same for us now, Jordan.
Yeah, I think anti-racist, we talk about this, being not racist is not enough. Dr. Beverly Tatum has a great example. She talks about how racism is in some of the fabric, it's in the fabric of America, and it's like a moving walkway. And if we just stand on there, we'll keep on going and keep perpetuating the inequities. But it takes the action of turning around, going against the walkway, and doing something different. Being quiet or not saying something is being complicit in perpetuating it. So being anti-racist is first doing the learning to see maybe this is a way that we shouldn't go. And having the conviction to say, let me turn around, go against this moving walkway that everyone is going on, and design and work to create a new world. And that's what the anti-racism work. And we've talked about how hard that actually is, to see it something and say, I'm gonna fight for a different view of the world. Because it's standing up against racist policies, racist actions, folks that might be saying things that perpetuate some of the racial inequities in our own sphere of circles. And sometimes that's really uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Lori, can you give us some examples of anti-racist actions in the day-to-day?
Yeah, sure. I think sometimes people get really stuck on when we talk to them about being anti-racist or taking anti-racist actions or making a choice to do anti-racist work. They think that they have to be an activist, that means going to protests, that means maybe doing things that they're either not physically capable of doing or not ready to do. Sometimes I've actually talked with people who have issues with anxiety and anxiety disorder, and the thought of being in a crowd or something is really frightening to them. So they think, oh, I can't do anything. But actually, there are many actions that people can take on a daily basis, and they can be very small. And the best way, I think, is to use whatever skills you have, what you're good at. You can use those skills in a way to take some action that would be an anti-racist action. I'll tell a funny story about one person I know that is not by any means an activist, but does take anti-racist actions. It's my 85-year-old father. In 2016, during the election, he decided by doing all his reading that Donald Trump, the candidate, was a white supremacist who, if elected, would cause great racial strife and make racism worse if he were to be in the White House. That was my dad's conclusion. My dad's worked out at the same gym for 45 years, and that's his sphere of influence, the guys at the gym. And so every day during the election, when he would go to the gym, he would take off his usual baseball cap and he would put on a MAGA, Make America Great Again cap, and enter the gym. And it would cause all of the Trump potential voters to approach him and say, yeah, great. And then my dad would start to tell them that you can't vote for this racist. You just can't do it, and here's why. And it was the kind of thing that he would never tell anybody that he did. It wasn't something that was, again, like some big protest, but for him, the best way to take action was to influence the people that he had influence over to make an anti-racist choice. And that's just, one way. And it's just about do something, whether it's attending a city council meeting and speaking out against some of the racist policies that are happening, whether it's going and working at the school board level. There's no end of opportunity to take those kinds of actions. It could be in the home, in the way that the books that you have in your house, the conversations that they have, who visits you, what you watch, all of these things can give you an opportunity to take a specific anti-racist action.
Thank you, Lori. That leads us perfectly into Coach's essay, his op-ed in the Union Tribune, and I want to ask him about that. But first, I want to read just a short excerpt that I think captures the concern about social media and this moment. And he writes, quote, "I'm speaking, of course, about the here today and gone tomorrow nature of social media itself. Outlets like Instagram have become little more than an on-demand virtual pat on the back. Post a picture, count the likes, get a few emoji-laden comments, and make yourself feel good, and then do it all again the next day. This is the common cycle of your average social media user. The issue this creates when it comes to social justice activism is that it allows these same users, regardless of their beliefs or real-life actions, to co-opt a very serious movement, be applauded for their support, and then go on about their business without ever actually doing anything worthwhile." That's pretty powerful. Coach, what compelled you to write this essay? Tell us about what you were seeing.
Okay, and man, it's weird to hear your writing read out loud. I was like, oh,
Yeah, I bet. It's really good.
Yeah, what compelled me to write it was this kind of realization that I had as I, after the tragic death of George Floyd, I had a lot of people reaching out to me, and I'm 26. Most of my friends are on Instagram, Twitter, whatever it might be, heavily into social media. So I started seeing a lot of social media posts about what was going on, and people kind of, this is what I believe, this is what I don't believe, whatever. And I had this realization that one, that it can be so harmful to use social media to kind of make a statement or put your face to a movement and leave it there. It can be so harmful because there's such an opportunity for anyone to make an actual change by educating themselves about what they can do and taking real action and doing all those things. And especially people of great influence, because when they do it and leave it there, then, the younger people or whoever it is that follows them, that sees that, says, oh, look at that. They posted their square, or they said this. Like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. I'm going to do that too. And then they too leave it, they move on. And so it's like this domino effect of people kind of believing, yeah, social media is where I need to make my statement, and I'm going to move on. And the thing about that is, obviously, in the society that we're in, social media is where a lot of people live. So for them, it's a legitimate belief. Like, this is what's important to me. So if I say something on Instagram, that's a big, statement. That's a big move. I'm really helping. And so I think it's just important to tell people, like, hey, this is super cool. I'm glad that you're willing to do that. But what this moment and this country and these people actually need is for you to get out and do something. Just like Lori said, it does, there's so many ways that you can help. There's so many facets of the movement and facets of systemic racism, that can be fought, that you just have to do something. But if you're only going to do one thing, and that one thing is social media, then it's not really much of a help at all. So
You know,
So,
you brought that up because I want to mention something I forgot to say before, but there's a great resource on medium.com, 97 things that white people can do for racial justice. And maybe, I don't know if Kim can put a link to it, but it is updated continually. And there's more than 97 now. So for people who really feel like, I don't know what that means, do something beyond social media, great list is already out there.
well, and I think, was it Coach or Lori who said the other day, or maybe it was Jordan, or maybe it was all three of you when we were talking about the feeling of being overwhelmed. Like, where do I even start? This is so baked into everything. Like, how can I make an impact on this? Like, tell us about like where to start, where to take action. Who wants to start with that one?
Yeah, I'll just start by saying that it's so true. It's so easy to get that feeling of being overwhelmed, looking at the problem and realizing that it's so big because it's huge. Because, like we said, it is in every part of our system here in America, and feeling like, okay, what do I do now? I went to a protest. What do I do now? I post on Instagram or I called city council. And now what? And so I think it's just important. One thing that's been big for me is local politics, to actually be informed about the policies that are being passed in our own city, where our money is going, the budgets, and all those things. So that's been a big thing for me, is educating myself as well about just what's happening in our city and budget-wise and with city council and all that stuff. That's one place to start.
I think that was a good one. I was going to say that. I think reading as well. Self-education is so important to make sure that you are having an intention that's not going to do harm. Because I think we have a lot of well-intentioned people that want to, like, there's this, like, I just want to do something. And before being proactive or super active, it's important to make sure you're actually being a co-conspirator in the work and helping and not actually being harmful. So books like White Fragility, How to Be Anti-Racist, Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence are great books to reference. I also think too, to Gyasi's point, I think especially in movements, I would say when you're thinking about a movement, if you want to like post something on Instagram like a black square, I would say consider aligning yourself with the outcome of the movement just as much as you are with the movement itself. If you are going to post a black square, consider what is the outcome we're trying to get by posting black squares, and then figure out how you can be a productive ally in pushing that agenda. Don't come with your own agenda. Specifically, if you're a non-black person, listen to black folks leading, believe black folks leading, and then figure out how can I work towards an outcome with the resources and privileges that I hold.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's helpful, and I think we talked about a little bit about this the other day, but pick an area of focus. It can get really overwhelming. You got kids in elementary school, focus on anti-racist school activities. Believe me, you will have opportunity. There's plenty of work that needs to be done. Maybe you want to focus on your local government. A lot of people don't pay attention to local government. And if you want to think about where the police budget comes from, right? You need to pay attention locally. But I think the overwhelm comes from there's so many categories or areas where there needs to be tremendous work. If you can just narrow it and stay with it, that one piece, you can get really good at knowing how to make change. And technology is really helpful. You can sign up for the alerts for your city council meetings, or for, other announcements coming out about something that's going to be heard, in the assembly. There are plenty of ways to keep informed. And if you focus on your area, I think you can be a lot more effective and not get as overwhelmed.
Yeah, Jordan was saying the other day to just look at your own sphere of influence, right? And start there. What can you do in your own sphere and in your own life and work? And I think that's so important too, like what speaks to you. And Coach was saying, look, if we all do that in our own spheres, everybody's doing that at the same time, it has so much more of an impact, and we can really start to change things. My follow-up question to taking action and that advocacy for Black Lives Matter, when does it become, when does the advocacy for Black Lives Matter by non-Black people become too much? Is there a point where there's an overstepping in advocacy, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it goes to kind of to what Gyasi was talking about, where I think I think as you're entering advocacy movements, really being able to do the work and assess yourself of, am I doing this to progress the movement or to progress my personal identity because I feel guilty and I want to do something? Because I think oftentimes folks can step into the movement and feel like, well, I want to lead this and I want to do this. And it's like, this is why it's really important to listen to Black leaders or folks in the movement, because if not, it can really do more harm than good. And so I think it looks and it feels frustrating. Despite intention, although there are some really well-intentioned folks, it can feel like people are overstepping bounds, and Black folks will respond and be like, hey, like, chill, calm down. And I think as white folks in this space, I think even with the energy, it's being able to take that and say, this is right. This is not my movement. This is not something that I need to be centered at. It's not about me. And reminding yourself, if you get checked or reminded or called in by someone, being able to take that in grace and love, because it's really about all of us and we need all folks, but being able to say, okay, let me assess myself and take a step back. It might feel like a check. It might feel like you're saying too much. It might feel like you need to take a step back, but being okay with that, because the ultimate outcome is to progress the movement, not our personal agenda or our personal identity.
Jordan, can you explain for everybody what we hear centering? What does that mean when we're talking about centering someone?
Yeah, so if you think about a conversation, you can think about, some folks talk about if you take up space. So for example, a lot of times, if you take it to like a gendered space, if men take up a lot of space in a meeting, they're talking over people, you're bringing in your thoughts, your things, you're centering what you feel you're bringing as the most valuable. And it can feel like you're having power over people in a position, in a place where we're trying to build coalition and work with others. So centering means what I'm saying is gonna be valuable. I'm gonna make sure you hear it. And even if you disagree with anything else, you're gonna know what I just said. And that's not helpful, especially if it's a non-Black person in part of a Black movement.
Yeah, I can share a little bit of a story as a white person being in the place of a movement and figuring out what that role is. For about 20 years, I've worked in support of Native American activists who've been working on removing racist team names and mascots from both pro teams and local schools. And I was asked first to join in 1988 by the director of the American Indian Education Commission, who they knew that having a non-Native person who works in social justice field could be helpful. And so I said, absolutely, I'm here to work with you. And if you know me, and you guys are knowing me a little bit already, you know, I like to talk, and I enjoy it, and I have a lot to say about a lot of things. But the best thing that I could do in that first year of working with this Native American coalition throughout California is not talk. And so for over a year, every single meeting of this group, and I was eventually the co-chair of the group at their request, I didn't say anything. And I think I bring that up as sometimes not doing what we are trained to do and used to doing is really the most helpful and the most powerful, because while I wasn't talking, I was learning. I was learning a lot. And so when we finally got to be out in front of the California Assembly, or we got in front of, you know, the people representing pro sports teams, I knew so much more about how to play a role that was helpful and when it was helpful than I would have had I not listened.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could just add to that super quick, I think one thing you can glean from Lori's example is, as you are entering the space and listening, you can find out where you're needed. Because I think there's one thing specifically in the movement is that we need all folks that we can. Like we want this message, and we want folks to be held accountable and talk and have these conversations. And I think when you're going with the listening stance, you could really see, okay, someone has this role, someone has that role. I can see where I fit in. And so going in, like I was saying, without an agenda of I want to be the leader versus saying I want to be an active participant and someone that's helpful to the cause. And that starts with like what Laura's saying, listening and seeing where you can go.
Yeah. And one more thing on that too is, like Jordan says, like when you're coming into that space, checking your agenda, because sometimes people are coming into that space and their agenda is not necessarily, hey, I'm going to take over, but their agenda is like, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to prove to you how much I care about this. I'm going to prove to you how sorry I am. I'm going to prove to you how bad I feel. And that's not really helpful either. And so, you know, it's fine to feel bad or guilty or whatever it is. But do it on your own time. If you're coming in to be a part of a movement, then come in ready to go and ready to be told, hey, this is what I need from you. And I'm so glad you're here. So can you do this for me? And not, hey, I'm here, guys, and I'm going to do all this like weird performative stuff to show you that I'm like down, like we're good. If you just show up, and if you want to show up, cool, and you can help. And we don't need you to come in with the kente cloth and just like, you know what I'm saying? Like just
do it too much. Do it too much.
just show up and you know, be open to receive whatever we need. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a great message. On the flip side, what about shutting down? Because that's a problem too, right? And if white people especially feel like they feel threatened by some of these discussions, and then they kind of go to their reflex of just like backing away and not engaging. Lori, what can you've worked in this space for so long with so many different groups, what can you tell white people specifically, but maybe others who are uncomfortable about this and they want to just kind of disengage? How do they stay involved in this discussion?
I mean, I think the first thing I do when I'm in those moments is to acknowledge, you know, they come in and they think of themselves as good people. I'm a good person. I've tried really hard. You know, I have a, you know, African-American grandson. I mean, sometimes they do have a real heart connection to whatever the issue is, and they feel like they're a good person. And so I want to say, you know, look, you are a good person. That's why you're here. That's why you want to learn. That's why you care. But as a good person, it's going to be really painful for you to learn what the truth is about racism and how there's a system that you didn't create, but you benefit from. And it's something bigger, right, than all of you. And that it's going to be very hard and very painful for you to engage sometimes. And so the important thing is to make a commitment to stay and to really work on getting comfortable being uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable. And if you really care about creating change, which you do, because otherwise you wouldn't be here, that the secret is you can make a decision to learn, or you can make a decision to protect yourself. You can't do both.
Jordan, how have you navigated in the groups that you have led on these topics? How have you navigated that tendency to be defensive and to shut down? And how do you bring people back, like Lori was mentioning, to engage?
Exactly what Lori said. Yes to everything Lori just said. I think this is also why it's important to have like white co-conspirators doing the work, because sometimes it's better if you have a white person talking to a white person about this than a black person. Like sometimes the message is different receiving. So I think that's why it's important in coalition building to think about, who do I have in my network, or is there someone you can have to talk with it with? And so I think I always coach through folks if I have the capacity to it, because sometimes I'm like, someone else might need to do this conversation, but really figuring out, exactly like Lori said, where are you entering this space and how can we help you get through this? Because your defensiveness is not helpful. And I think some of the times people take it personal, like, I'm a horrible person, I'm doing this, I'm doing something. Look, we are all socialized in a system that might have had us internalize beliefs, actions, and behaviors that we might be unconsciously doing that we might not even be aware of. So I'm not gonna guilt you for it, but I am gonna say, now that you are aware of this, how do we help you get past this and continue on the journey? Because I need you to come with me, but I need us to get over this small speed bump, and let's not center it on you. Let's acknowledge where it comes from, deal with it, and move on so we can move forward. And for some folks, they can handle it there. For some folks, like, I need to take a step back and do it. And it varies. I would hope every person could say, let's do this right now, but folks are at different levels, and sometimes it takes a little bit longer for others.
It's a powerful message, Jordan, to tell someone like that, like, hey, you are a product of this system. Now let's change that system.
Yeah. And that's why
really empowering, right?
Yeah, that's why I tell people the problem might not lie within you. It just might lie within the system you're benefiting from. So how do we look at first the system that might have given you some values or beliefs or things that might be harmful? And then how do we help you interrogate and work through those? Because once you get through those, you can check your friends, you can check your aunt, you can check your uncle, you can tell everyone, and we can slowly start making sure that other folks are aware of this. Because sometimes it's those dinner conversations where some of the most problematic things can be said and go unchecked.
Mm-hmm. You know, another big part of this, I think, that I've learned over many years is also help people get skills. You know, if white people sincerely want to be supportive and engaged, it doesn't mean they have the skills to do it, and you're going to be a lot more effective with it. And so non-defensive listening is a skill, right? Learning to recognize your unconscious and conscious bias, that's a skill. So I think that can help when it can feel less personal when there is work to be done and getting skilled up for the work. I think that can help.
Coach was nodding emphatically earlier. Did you want to chime in on this one before we go to a question?
Yeah, that's so funny. I'm a big nodder.
So
Yeah,
I love it.
to Jordan's point, I think a lot of times you do have to give people that goodwill hunting. You just gotta, hey, it's not your fault. Because people, they're connected. they kind of connected to, you're saying what they hear is you're the problem.
Yeah.
And not you're a part of the problem, or you're subconsciously participating in the problem, or you're a product of the larger problem. They just hear you're the problem.
Yeah.
And so immediately that wall goes up and they're like, no, I would never, like you were saying. And so I think sometimes it can be exhausting to, obviously we're already in this movement and fighting. So sometimes it's exhausting to try and go back and say, hey, like, I really want to help you kind of grasp what this is and what it's not. But I am kind of a little busy right now.
Right.
And so like Jordan said, it's like, I got to figure out who can I kind of enlist or delegate, like, to that understands how to communicate this to you, so I can keep fighting the way that I'm fighting right now, but I'm not going to leave you out in the cold. If you legitimately want to understand and want to come alongside me in this, then I don't want to brush you off, but I also don't necessarily have time to tell you like, hey, it's okay. You know what I'm saying? Like, so it's like kind of a duality thing there.
And I think to Gyasi, to that point, I think in this movement, we are talking about people's lives. And we are talking about humanity. We are talking about the deaths that we have seen time and time again. So I think sometimes white people need to understand too, if a Black person is upset or doesn't have the patience, it is not Black folks' responsibility to do the emotional labor to walk with you through when you get defensive or get upset, because the urgency and the frustration is we are seeing folks who look like us every single day either killed or still living in systems that are perpetuating injustices. And we don't apologize for the tier that you might fall. We're saying some hard truth. And what we really want, like in that real active allyship, is walk with us in this or check in with someone else, because we are fighting just to live in a time that we're in.
Jordan, when is it appropriate for white people to ask for help or guidance from their Black and brown friends and colleagues?
I think it depends on relationship. Lori and I were talking about this. It really depends on relationship. I during the season, Gyasi and I were talking about, we've had folks who have hit us up who I haven't talked to in years since high school, just saying like, hey, I want to check in on you. Like, I just want to see, like, can you help me do this? I'm like, I don't even remember your name. How do you still have my number? And so I think it goes with the relationship. And I think if, like, for me, it's more telling. I graduated high school back in late 2000. If someone is hitting me up to ask me for information, you're going to tell me for over 10 years, you have not made another Black friend that you can talk to. That's something about what white people need to do than what I feel I need to do in stewarding this relationship. And so I think if you look in your friend circle and you don't have a Black friend or someone, I'm not saying go get a Black friend, but I'm saying it's like we need to be very mindful of who we're leaning on and making sure that we have the relationship. And if you don't have a Black friend, do not, like, there's a website, there's Google, there's books, there's so much more you can do, but lean on those relationships, because if you don't have them, it is emotionally taxing on folks to all of a sudden have people coming in just trying to have a conversation.
Right.
Yeah, and I would also add too, even the people you are in a relationship with, be mindful of the way that you kind of come in. I've had conversations with a lot of people that I care about very much, and some of them have come in and said, what can I do right now? I want to help. And then some of them, I was telling Lori earlier, some of them have said, okay, well, what do you want to see me do? And I'm like, it's not about me or what I want to see or whatever. There is very real injustices happening. And so if you feel like you want to come alongside this movement to stop or overturn those injustices, great. If you're just worried about what I think about whatever you're doing, then we can, I don't know, hit me up later or something, but that's not the point. And so to Jordan's point, like, relationship is important. There's a lot of people I've heard from that I'm like, who are you?
Where have you been?
Even people that I'm very close with, I've noticed there's a difference. You know what I mean? There's people who I can tell like they're coming in to help, and then there's people who are kind of trying to almost like absolve themselves. Like, okay, if I do this, am I good? If I do this, am I good? Like, where's the, you know what I mean? So.
Right.
At Jones, we're doing a lot of listening sessions where people can talk through some of these things. And one of the things we get asked a lot is about that, about reaching out to a Black friend or to a colleague or whatever. And when people aren't sure whether it's appropriate or not, I try to get them to think about it in terms of, imagine this, your friend has had a death in the family. Are you close enough to this person that you would go to the funeral? Are you close enough to this person that you would send a card or make a phone call? To determine whether or not there is that kind of relationship there, because sometimes people don't really get it, that they're not as close as they might think they are. And then if they are, just like when you call somebody who's been through a horrific loss in their family, if any of you've ever been through this, when people call and say, what do you want me to do? You don't know what you want them to do. You're barely functioning.
Yes.
So if they call and say, care about you, thinking of you, I'm going to send over dinner tomorrow night to your family because I know you're busy and you're stressed. Great, thank you. But to try to think about it in those terms and not just make this assumption that I have a close connection to you because I know you from school or work 5 years ago.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from our audience, and this is talking about the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And the question is, Dr. Kendi, that's the author, Ibram Kendi. Kendi says only focus on the policies for anti-racism versus trying to change hearts and minds one by one. How do you feel about this? I'm going to start with Coach on this one.
So I actually was having a similar conversation with Brandon Stepp, who I mentioned to you guys the other day. Brandon Stepp, he runs the David's Heart Foundation. Amazing guy. But we were talking about this and basically kind of came to the conclusion that at the end of the day, people make policy. And so you have to, in some capacity, reach people's hearts and minds and change people's hearts and minds because the system is built by people. And so, yeah, there's a lot of policies that we need to change or throw out or whatever it is, but that doesn't happen without the people because that's the way the system of our country is built. And so, yeah, just kind of like a preliminary thought on that is like, you can't necessarily have one without the other. So.
And we have plenty of people and we have plenty of time in the sense that we can work on policy and also stand up to the racist guy in the parking lot. You know, I mean, on a daily basis, I think there's all kinds of actions that can be taken. And I think the reason that's important is it's about kind of staying motivated and connected and involved. If people wait to fight policy A, policy B, policy D, and they're sort of, you know, looking for those kinds of big moments, it can be hard to stay connected emotionally to the change that has to happen by people being fully engaged. So I think both are critical.
I agree with both of them. I think the only thing I would just kind of expand on is I think you can think of different policies that operate different ways in government, but also what are the policies at your workplace? What are the policies at your school institutions, particularly around like expulsion and suspension of students? Like, I think there's so many policies that inform so many things in our life. And I think taking the time to look at policies from a state level, federal are very, very important. And I think as Gyasi was saying as well, local politics are politics too. And there's politics within schools and so many other things that we can look at those policies to see what ways can we make sure that they're more equitable and supportive of all folks who are involved in the institutions.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question. This is from Lillian Lindvay. She is a LEAD alumna, and she works for the San Diego executive search firm Blair Search Partners. And so she has a recruiting question for you. She says they have a commitment to helping our clients build diverse teams. As such, we are constantly looking for ways to better promote leaders that reflect the communities they serve. Are there particular channels or groups, both locally and nationally, you would recommend us reaching out to as a way of connecting with potential candidates that we may not be in conversation with? You want to take this one, Lori?
Call our founder, Dr. Stephen Jones.
Lily and I can connect you.
Yeah, and I think that's not a part of the work that I'm in, but I
Mhm.
know that there are definite powerful resources available. There's a lot of guidance now available for making those kinds of changes within the company. I know he is certainly someone that would be able to answer that question.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think just there's a robust amount of like nonprofits that are doing work within San Diego. I know you all have them listed out on the website from, I'm gonna plug Reality Changers has alumni. We have institutions at universities like NSBE's, the National Society of Black Engineers. MANA does stuff, amazing stuff with Latino women in the community. So there's a lot of specific community groups that are in San Diego that could be great places, that could be pipelines for diverse candidates into the different roles you all are looking for.
Good answer.
Great. How about you, Coach? Do you have any input on recruiting? I work with
No.
some pretty fantastic students.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, just look, I don't know, it's tough because it's not necessarily my area of expertise, but, come on down to the Monarch School and meet some of these guys that I got and ladies. Because there's really awesome kids who I think don't always end up in those kind of leadership opportunities or programs based on where they're coming from or resources or whatever. So, just finding ways to elevate them as well and kind of give them those opportunities.
Okay, we've got another question here. This is an interesting one. Growing up in Los Angeles, I feel I was not brought up to be prejudiced. I was 14 in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was disgusted by the segregation and prejudice. Question is, does being in Los Angeles mean people are less prejudiced than other locations?
Well, that is an interesting question, and I think I'm just going to speak from experience. I think there is, my kids were raised in Los Angeles, and certainly when they were old enough to go look at colleges or go off outside of Los Angeles, it was a huge adjustment for them because they were used to being in a very multiracial, multicultural classroom where there was no majority group, for example. And so there was much more familiarity, and they had a much broader friend group and cultural understanding. So I think that does make a difference in terms of personal bias and comfort and familiarity. So that was my observation experience. I think the system is the same in terms of racism. It's the same system. There can be different areas where there is strong cultural connection and familiarity and partnership. That can be helpful in the movement to change racism. Like my kids both have a real comfort in doing anti-racist work and being among many different cultures and age groups, and because that's their LA experience, but it doesn't guarantee that the biases won't be there.
I think it's also a matter of how overt it is, right? Or if it's just sort of under the surface. I think in California, we think that, we're a lot more progressive here, but we did a webinar few weeks ago with Dr. Jones and Nora Vargas and Tony Young, and Dr. Jones and Tony Young were talking about how San Diego, it had the nickname of the Mississippi of the West, it might look like things are more progressive here, but there's, under the surface, it's really not very different.
Yeah.
One more question, and that's about this is another kind of geography question and sort of segregation in cities. So how do we create connections across sort of racial and ethnic lines when cities like ours are so segregated? And that's true in a lot of American cities. How do we create more connections and comfort and ease with each other and work together when we're separated physically?
That is a good question, and it's tough. Like, I just think about personally for me, as a kid, like I said in my bio, I grew up in the Southeast. So, Skyline, the Lemon Grove area, Spring Valley area, whatever. And it wasn't really until I was in high school when I ended up going to Mission Bay High that I really kind of started to see this whole other kind of coastal part of San Diego. it wasn't even a part of my life. The beach wasn't, I lived in San Diego my whole life, and the beach wasn't even a part of my life until I went into high school, and I had opportunities to do things like Young Life. I had opportunities to do whatever. I did theater at school, academic league, whatever. And through those kind of extracurriculars, I was able to learn more about my community and my city and be put in rooms with people who I probably would never have been in rooms with. And so I think it is super important for those opportunities to exist for students. And unfortunately, that's one of the things that when you look at like our budget, sorry, I'm like kind of rambling, but when you look at like the city budget and things like that, the first things that tend to go is the arts, or sports, or those kind of things. And unfortunately, that's what really a lot of times is going to give students opportunities to get outside of their regular sphere of influence and the things that they know. And you get the opportunity to connect with people who aren't like you when you're on a sports team, when you're in a theater company, when you're participating in band or something like that. And those connections kind of happen a lot in those settings. And so I think kind of putting a focus on that as one way of fostering that connection, just again, I always think through the lens of like students because that's my focus. But that's one thing that I kind of see there.
Yeah, Gyasi, I really agree with you. My mind goes there also because those programs get cut, and youth who are more open to thinking differently, and they're in the process of looking at their own individuality and they're looking at their own values, a lot of openness can happen, particularly in adolescence. But those are the first programs that get cut. But when you have programs like that do bring youth together, that also brings their parents together in some sort of ways. Because there's, other than the workplace, adults are also pretty segregated. And so if we put some money into intentionally bringing youth together across differences, I think that makes a huge help. And the segregation right now is especially by class. They're not opportunities to engage pretty much outside of their socioeconomic class, because even if they are in sports or theater or whatever, it's generally within that part of their community. It's not something that goes beyond that.
Yeah, I was just going to echo what both of them said. I think it is like a race and class discussion, and thinking about how do we create cities that welcome folks where they can feel like they're other spaces. Like I've talked with a lot of students of color that I'll say north of the 8, like that's not for us. Or those communities are for other people. Right. And that goes back to a history of redlining and segregation and how these things have all impacted. And so I think the real question is, how do we redistribute power equitably around like racial difference so that communities can represent and welcome difference and not just be, well, these are where the white people live and these are where the black people live. Yeah. How do we create those cities and environments knowing that we have a history that was built to segregate, and then how do we look at what do we do now with what we have?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. We can't even really start that conversation until people just feel like they're allowed to be, anywhere in their city. I've been living in Ocean Beach for 5 years, and it took me 2 years living in Ocean Beach to feel like I was even allowed to live here, and so Jordan's absolutely right. Like, that conversation has to come first. How do we make everyone feel comfortable and safe? There's a lot of places where people of color do not feel safe, just right here in San Diego. And so how do we start there and then kind of go from there? So yeah, absolutely, Jordan. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. It's time for us to close. This has been such a great discussion. So many great thoughts and counsel and direction. And I just thank you all for being with us today. Jordan Harrison, Lori Nelson, Gyasi Redding, thank you for providing us with this deeper understanding and some tools for action. We're going to be back on Wednesday, July 29th at 2 p.m. for a discussion on reopening in a more inclusive way, although reopening seems to get farther and farther away these days, but that's okay. We're going to be ready when it happens. The pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement, both have really broken open a lot of the ways we think and the ways we work, and we really have an opportunity here for some reinvention when we put things back together. So that's what we're going to be talking about next time. What changes can we make to make things more equitable and more inclusive? Again, everyone, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our guests. And on behalf of Lead San Diego, I wish you all well. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.